commemoration of the suffrage movement. Nate Levin, thank you so much for joining us today and continue the stories of women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, I'm going to get my books and we'll get going. And,
You can turn the camera on now.
all right.
Yes, I have.
Wow.
Thank you, Nate.
Thank you, CJ. It's always great to hear you. Thank you for coming out. I'm really very excited to be here. This is the first time I've ever spoken to a group of activists. Barnard Club, Rotary Club, history buffs, but not activists. And if the story of the suffrage movement is about anything, it's about activism. I feel like maybe I'll start by razzing the audience just for fun. And, my theme is competing narratives. So believe me, let your narratives compete with mine today. If you have questions, arguments, disagreements, if you want to come up and give a counter lecture for 5 or 10 minutes, please just raise your hand or just yell out your objection or your question or your counter statement. And I'd like this to be as interactive as possible. So let me start with a trick question. And the trick question is, when is the suffrage centennial? When is the suffrage centennial? It's a trick question, but someone's going to answer it. Okay.
5 years.
So the answer I got was in 5 years, 2020, referring to the 100th anniversary of the adoption of the 19th Amendment in 1920. But actually, what if you saw the movie My Cousin Vinny, the answer to that question is a question in New York style, which is, why is it a trick question? And the reason why it's a trick question is the answer depends on where you are. Now, if you are in my home state of New York, the suffrage centennial is in 2017. Because women won the right to vote in New York State in 1917, which was, up to that point in time, the biggest win in the whole history of the women's rights movement. But we are not in New York now. I can notice that from the palm trees and so forth. So we're in Arizona. When is or was the suffrage centennial? 1912. Right, not right. Women won the vote in Arizona in 1912. And, there were, up until the 1912 elections, there were 6 states where women had full voting rights. So in 1912, 3 states, women won in 3 states. Arizona was one, Oregon was another, and Kansas was the 3rd state in 1912. So I've been tracking things for quite a number of years now, and I didn't see a lot of celebration coming out of Arizona of this great centennial. I guess there was kind of a statehood centennial that got all the attention. Kansas didn't seem to do very much, but in Oregon they did a lot of celebrating and a lot of commemorating. I kind of ascribe that to a red state, blue state kind of thing. So, you guys have 5 years to gear up to make up for your default in 1912. So I think I've razzed the audience enough. Let me get to my competing narratives. And here's narrative number 1, Century of Struggle, a classic book by Eleanor Flexner. One of the best history books I've ever read. For my money, the best book ever written about women's history. Came out in 1959, has never been out of print. Wonderful, wonderful classic narrative. I don't know, I have a feeling that maybe some of the audience may have graduated from college before 1959. Am I right? Am I wrong? I don't know, but if it was later, and if you studied American history, and if they didn't have you read this book, then they committed academic malpractice. So no, really, if you're a serious student of American history, this is the book to read. And yet, this narrative has now been successfully challenged or compellingly challenged for the first time by this recently published book, The Myth of Seneca Falls. The Myth of Seneca Falls. So we're going back to the 19th century and the suffrage movement in the 19th century. So, I mean, has everyone heard the standard narrative? Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, the Susan B. Anthony dollar, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's one version. Another version goes somewhat differently. And so let me take you back to 1870, which is when the suffrage movement at that time, which had grown quite a bit from its beginning, that's when they looked back to the beginning of the movement to celebrate the progress they had made. And the beginning point that they celebrated was the Worcester Convention of 1850. Seneca Falls was not on the radar of the movement in 1870. And so the question is, how did Seneca Falls come to be such a big deal? And how is it that there's a National Historic Site in Seneca Falls? Anyone been there? Anyone ever visited Seneca Falls? So it's great, isn't it? I mean, I visited it. I brought my wife along, and she's not a history buff. She had a great time. The rangers were wonderful. I had a great experience at Elizabeth Cady Stanton's house, which what's left of it is preserved. You know, they've preserved the meeting room there where the convention was held. They have a wonderful exhibit there. It's pretty far from any place where most people go, but it's a great place. But unfortunately, in a way, it's the wrong place, because the women's rights movement was already going before 1848. Lucy Stone was one of the top lecturers in the country, and lecturing was one of the main, going to a lecture was one of the main forms of entertainment in those days. You know, there was no TV, no radio, no internet. There were newspapers, but it was that and lectures. That was about it. So she was a very prominent lecturer. She was an anti-slavery lecturer, and she was a women's rights lecturer, including the right to vote. And in fact, Lucy Stone inspired Susan B. Anthony to join the movement. And later, you know, after the Civil War, the movement was split, and it was Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony leading one group. It was Lucy Stone and her husband leading another group. And actually, for the first at least 10 years or so after they split in 1869, Lucy Stone's organization was larger than Stanton and Anthony's organization. So how did Seneca Falls get to be central to the story? Well, there's a kind of a cliche that history is written by the winners. I mean, we all know that cliche. But what happened in this case was Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the history and made themselves the winners, because over a period, and that's kind of the heart of this book, the Myth of Seneca Falls, because over the period of 10 years, 1876 to 1886, Stanton and Anthony and a third partner with whom they fell out and whom they kind of erased from history, wrote a 3-volume history of the women's suffrage movement, even though women only had suffrage in a few states at that time. You know, they were far from complete. But they thought, we're going to get this all down on paper. So it was 3 volumes, it was thousands of pages, they distributed it widely, and they did something else. They started commemorating this Seneca Falls Convention. And they had a meeting in 1873 to commemorate the 25th anniversary, and they kept going. They lived longer than Lucy Stone. They were in good health longer than Lucy Stone was. And what they were doing was competing for the central position in the leadership of the movement. You know, they were ambitious. Susan B. Anthony had sharp elbows. She had a will to power, which was one of the great assets of the movement. And, you know, you couldn't count on her to say what she said she was going to do, for her to do what she said she was going to do. But she wanted to be the top leader, and that's how she ended up. And partly it's because they wrote the book. They celebrated their partnership by commemorating Seneca Falls. Susan B. Anthony was not at Seneca Falls, but was associated with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, her partner. So they created this origin myth for the women's suffrage movement. So that's the competing narrative here, because the movement really, you know, the leadership was contested and it was chaotic. There were lots of things going on in lots of places with local leadership, local activists. So the message of this professor who wrote this book, Lisa Tetrault, her message is, let's get past Seneca Falls. Let's think of the movement as it really was, not the accomplishment of a few great women, but really a chaotic, widespread, diverse, grassroots movement that, I'm not hearing any questions, where really you can't tell a straight, simple storyline and tell a story that's not arbitrary. Really, it's about the kind of people who are in the room here, and there are local leaders like CJ, who's fabulous, and there were many, many local leaders who really made the movement happen. And it wasn't just Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton or even Lucy Stone and her husband, Henry Blackwell. It was the local movement of the times, local action to develop support and to really change the world, to change the country, to change the society, to change the world. So, you know, that's kind of, so those are our competing narratives. I mean, does anyone want to go back to the first narrative? You want a little refresher on it, or are we willing to let Seneca Falls go by the board? I actually think that the main museum for the suffrage movement should be in New York City, because for one thing, a lot of people go there, and a lot of people live there, and that was maybe where the most important battle was fought. You know, and it's not safely back in the middle of the 19th century, but it was in, you know, the 1910s, and it was the reform movement, and it was the, it was that era when everyone believed in progress instead of going back to the Stone Age. So I think, you know, it'd be wonderful to have a museum there where this story could really be told, and it could really be recovered to memory, and it could be told maybe in a way that respects the competing narratives and doesn't just give one version of the facts. So anyhow, that's my first set of competing narratives, the conventional story with Anthony and Stanton and Seneca Falls versus this chaos, this local leadership, this contested leadership. And that's the way social movements, I think, really happen. You know, that's the way the same-sex movement, which we've had the wonderful experience of seeing develop over the last 10, 20 years and more, that's how they won. It was not just one leader, it was not just one central committee that made it happen. So it was people like the people in this room who made it happen, and who are going to make the work of the women's suffrage movement be completed. Because my mom told me to avoid statistics, but I hope I've got you warmed up enough to throw a couple of statistics out there, without losing you too much. Okay, how many women are in the Senate? How many U.S. senators are women? Who knows the answer? 20 women. What would be 50% representation in the Senate, given that there are 100 senators? 50, right? So we're shy a few women in the Senate, I would have to say. But the trend is good, because in 1991, how many women senators were there? Two 2, that's correct, 2. So we've gone from 2 to 20 over the past 25 years. The trend is going in the right direction. But we have a lot of work still to be done. I'm channeling CJ now. We have a lot of work. I mean, I realize you have other fish to fry here, a lot of red fish to fry. But while you're frying those fish, maybe you can put a few more on the griddle, and maybe you can get a woman elected senator from the state of Arizona.
Wow.
Because that has never happened. That has never happened. We've had 2 governors, one very good, one I probably shouldn't say anything about. But in New York, we have never had a woman governor. We've had 2 U.S. senators. We're on our second one. I think most of you know who the first one was. And but there are a lot of states that have either never had a senator. Okay, Hillary was the first woman to represent New York State in the U.S. Senate. Okay, that question is to apply. But there are many, many states. I mean, the number of women governors is low. I think it's around 10. It may be less. That's low. And if you go to where maybe the real power sits and the CEOs of the Fortune 500, what percentage of them are women? Anyone want to? Yes.
Less than 1.
Well, it's about 5%. It's about 5%. They're about 25 or 26. So, but that is extremely low. This is 100 years on after the 19th Amendment. And those are the folks who are writing the checks and calling the shots. And 95% of them are men. So as I say to my father, and he gets a little bit uncomfortable when I say it, I think there are great changes yet to come. And, we'll live to see some of them, and some of them will happen after other people have come along to make those changes happen. So anyhow, let me, I think I got by with the statistics without boring them too much, Ron. Yeah. Because there are great changes to come. So the other set of competing narratives, and this, we're going to the 1910s now, and it was relatively small groups of people in the 19th century, but in the 1910s, the suffrage movement became a huge, tremendous, stupendous, powerful, overwhelming force in American society and politics. It became a huge mass movement, tremendous political momentum that they built up in the 1910s. And it's a huge story. It's not told so much. We're back at Seneca Falls again, and these brave 300 people and so forth. But really, the mass movement, when it was really shaking things up, was in the 1910s. So the competing narratives that come out of that, and they're still out there competing actively, is between the militant wing and Alice Paul, and the more conservative wing, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and Carrie Chapman Catt. I don't know, has everyone here heard of Alice Paul? Show of hands. Some people haven't heard of Alice Paul. Haven't seen Iron-Jawed Angels? It was an HBO movie, maybe at your library. It's mainly a terrible movie, but about a quarter of it, about 30 minutes of it, is very good. And it's the sequence where after they picketed the White House, and Alice Paul and her group were the first group ever to picket the White House. This was in 1917. They were, for a while they put up with the picketing, but then they threw them in jail for obstructing traffic. Total violation of their rights. They were thrown in jail. Alice Paul had been with the suffragettes in London. She'd been to jail. She'd done hunger strikes. She'd been force-fed. So when she was thrown in jail, when her followers were thrown in jail outside of Washington, D.C., they also went on hunger strikes. They also were force-fed. They were mistreated in other ways. So about 30 minutes of this movie is about that. I think it's pretty realistic, and it's pretty horrifying, and it's pretty effective. And there are a lot of people today who still think that that is why the 19th Amendment got adopted, because of the activism, the militance of Alice Paul and her followers, the tremendous publicity for the cause. Eventually, the outcry over their mistreatment got to be too great. They were released. They continued on with their militant tactics, and the 19th Amendment was adopted. So that's one narrative. I mean, if you read the best biography of Alice Paul, I mean, it doesn't say much about what the mainstream organization was doing, and kind of just gives the impression that Alice Paul convinced Woodrow Wilson to support suffrage, and that's why suffrage was adopted.
What's
But
the name of that?
the biography, it's called A Woman's Crusade, and it's by Mary Walton. It's a good book, it's a good read. Won't tell you the whole story of Alice Paul, but it will tell you about her time as an activist.
What's the name of that?
A Woman's Crusade, Mary Walton. And Iron Jawed Angels is worth a look too, but just don't believe the rom-com stuff. So the other narrative is the mainstream organization, and led by Carrie Chapman Catt, later founder of the League of Women Voters. This was the organization that came together in the 1890s when Lucy Stone and Susan B. Anthony reconciled and brought their organizations together. It was not too effective until 1915 when Carrie Chapman came back for her second term. But then it became tremendously effective. And not only was it effective as a national organization, but there was continuing to be a huge amount of local activism that was not directed from the center. So let me pose another question. As of 1920, when the 19th Amendment was adopted, in how many states did women have the right to vote for president already before the amendment? Does anyone want to guess?
10.
30. In about 15 states, they'd won full voting rights, including the Empire State, which was a huge, huge victory, which led on to most of the rest of what happened. But in about 15 other states, and in about another 15 states, they'd won partial suffrage, including the right to vote for presidential electors. Kind of the difference was, if you wanted full voting rights, you had to win a referendum and amend the state constitution. But by legislative action, in other words, if you could get a bill through the state legislature, you could get the right to vote for presidential electors. So all that stuff was still going on while Alice Paul was picketing, and while Carrie Chapman Catt was directing things, and they were lobbying in Washington, all of that. So there was this tremendous push that was going on the local level, as well as the things that the leaders of the center were doing. So again, to talk about getting past Seneca Falls, too much credit and attention has gone to the central leaders. Really, it was a mass movement, and it was a huge mass movement. We've heard about two waves of feminism, and there was a tremendous upsurge of activism among women in the period 1910 to 1920. And it was kind of, the tide was beginning to turn from 1906 to 1910. The public sentiment shifted. I don't know why. No one really knows why. I've seen different theories on it. But from 1910 to 1920, there was a huge upsurge in activism among women, a huge popular movement. And that happened again in our history in the late 60s and early 70s. And I lived through that. I have to admit I wasn't paying that much attention. Some of you were paying quite a bit more attention, probably. Maybe some of you were part of that. But we saw vast changes come about. I wonder if we're ever going to see a third wave, a third upsurge, The reasons are there. Maybe it will happen, maybe it won't. But I think while we're thinking about women's history, let's think about the grassroots. Let's give credit to the kind of people like the ones who are in the room here. And let's respect the leaders, let's tell their stories, but let's remember what was really behind them, which was the local leadership and the activism at the grassroots that put the movement over the top. So I'm going to stop talking now. I'll take questions. I'm very much open to any comments, disagreements, other perspectives that people would like to share. Yes.
As your mother, I'm going to ask the first question. Not a question, it's really a comment. Until 1920, a woman either lost her American citizenship or gained it on marriage. If she married, as my mother did, my mother was, and her family were from Palestine, but she married my father in 1919, and he was born in Pennsylvania. And so she gained her citizenship through my father. And that became law in 1920. And she talked about it quite often. Whenever she went to vote, she took me with her. But there was another case in my husband's side of the family where one of his aunts theoretically lost her citizenship by marrying someone who was not an American citizen. So this in 1920 was a tremendous gain, but it shows how little they thought about women and their interest in what their government was doing, that it could be either given or taken away. I guess with the assumption her husband would really hold the power.
Well, I hope everyone heard that. That women's citizenship depended on who they were married to until 1920. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that kind of stuff is still in a lot of people's heads. That men really are in some ways more capable and more fully human than women, and I believe it's going to take another 3 generations before we get rid of all that stuff, or until it's down to just a few isolated pockets. I think we still have, that great change that's going to occur, that needs to occur, is a lot of it is in people's attitudes and thoughts, but it's also in institutions as well. And I'm not going to get into my program now, but so other comments, other thoughts. Yes.
I'm just wondering the effect of World War I on women's suffrage.
Yeah.
Because it's overwhelming that men would give up so much power.
Well, yeah, it was